Hi, everyone, and welcome to the ARBEST monthly webinar series. Today's topic is Unspoken Wounds, the impact of trauma on language, development, sensory processing, and daily functioning. My name is Laura Landers, and I'll be your webinar moderator for today. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the ARBEST program and introduce our speakers. ARBEST, Arkansas Building Effective Services for Trauma, is a state-funded program at the UAMS Psychiatric Research Institute, and our aim is to improve mental health services for children and families who've experienced trauma. We work closely with multiple partners to build a more trauma-informed state, and we're probably best known for providing training to mental health professionals on treatments that are effective with helping children and families recover from trauma. A few housekeeping announcements before we begin. We encourage you to use the chat feature for any questions or comments that you might have throughout the webinar. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. If you're interested in receiving a CEU credits for this webinar, stick around to the very end and I'll give you more information on how to obtain that. We're recording this webinar and we will upload it to the ARBEST YouTube channel. We have previously recorded webinars there, so you can check those out. And be sure to check us out on Facebook, where we post upcoming monthly webinars, training opportunities, and other resources. I'm very excited to introduce today's presenters, Paula Keys and Lacey Lewis. Paula and Lacey, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. Can everybody hear us okay? If not, put a thumbs down or something in the chat. I'm just going to assume everyone can hear us. So my name is Lacey Lewis, and I am the speech language pathologist for the child diagnostic unit here at UAMS. I've been here for almost 10 years now. I did do contract work here initially as I was working doing speech therapy in a developmental preschool here in Little Rock, and then I transitioned over here full time. So I am really passionate about this unit and being part of it. We are so extremely unique, and I just hope that you guys can gain some information today and enjoy what you hear. And as we're going along, please feel free to interrupt us if you have any questions.
Perfect. Welcome, everybody. My name's Paula Keys, and I'm an occupational therapist. I've been in OT for 23 years. I've been practicing for 20. I took a few years off to do some homeschooling with my kids. And so I've practiced mainly in pediatrics my whole career. And so I've worked in outpatient facilities, clinics, preschools, daycares, things like that. And I've been at UAMS almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years in February. And so I've just really enjoyed my time here. It is a very unique program, and we have a very dynamic team, which makes it very interesting. So we hope that you guys can glean a little bit of tidbits that you could use in your practice to help you out. So we're happy to be here.
Okay. All right. We are both new to a webinar, so bear with us as we're trying to navigate through everything. So we put together a couple of objectives just to kind of touch base on the high points of what we're going to be talking about today. The majority of everything we're going to be discussing is going to be related to children, since that's pretty much all that we work with here. So forgive us if it doesn't apply to any adult or anyone else that you might be working with. So just a little overview of what a speech language pathologist is. We are typically thought of as the people who help people talk, and that's not necessarily the case. In the field of speech language pathology, we touch across many different domains. We do help people to communicate, but it's not just making them talk or helping them talk. It's also working on their language skills, their cognition skills. We do work with stuttering patients. We also work with voice and hearing, and then swallowing as well. We also help people across all ages of a lifespan, from birth all the way up until death, essentially. So speech and language and the development, with the development in our brain, we learn about a lot about the brain in school, and it's going to be important related to our discussion today in regards of trauma. We have our speech area that we are going to talk about just very briefly, and that's the articulation and like how kids and how we all just make our sounds and how we communicate using our voice, and then also fluency. And then we have the area of language. And this is a big area. This is how we communicate and how we use our words to engage with other people and sharing information, getting our wants and needs met. We really have three sort of big areas with language, and that's going to be receptive, expressive, and social language. So, receptive is just a huge understanding, comprehension piece of things. Expressive is how well we can express ourselves. And then social is going to be that communication and engagement that we have with those around us. For speech language pathology, the three areas in the brain that are pretty important for us are going to be Broca's area. This is not for you to be tested over, but this is located sort of in the farther back location of the frontal lobe. And then we have Wernicke's, which is going to be in our temporal lobe. The Broca's area is responsible for our expressive language, and Wernicke's area is responsible for our receptive language. And then the frontal lobe is all of that executive functioning, cognitive skills.
Okay, so what is an occupational therapist? So OTs help people across the lifespan do the things they want and need to do through therapeutic use of daily activities. And so we're looking at living life to the fullest, right? So those are all the things we do in our daily life. And it has to do with using what we have, using our skills for leisure, in addition to all of those activities of daily living that we engage in. And so sometimes we do have those barriers with injury, illness, or disability that we have to work around. And so OTs are good at helping you come up with alternative solutions so you can have some life satisfaction. With kids, we do look a lot in the school setting and in social situations too, because as kids, it's our job to play, to learn, and to grow. And so we either help kids learn skills, or if they have a disability or anything like that, to kind of use that and be able to promote independence with those skills. Okay, I don't know where to click. I see anyone? Oh, yeah. Right there. Okay. So when we think of the brain, we're in terms of motor skill development, we're talking about the cerebellum. Okay, and so that's our motor coordination and our balance. And these are voluntary skills. And then we have our frontal lobe. That's our impulse control, our decision making. You know, can we pump the brakes when we need to pump the brakes? And then, of course, our brainstem. And this deals a lot with regulation and then the fight, flight, or freeze stages. And then also as OTs, we look at reflexes. You know, a lot of times our reflexes can kind of clog up our brainstem. And so we work on integrating those reflexes so that the brainstem is free to allow for higher level thinking. Okay.
Is our camera by chance over the words? I don't know if anyone can see it. I don't want it to be in the way.
It's in the way. Yeah, because we are screen sharing. Okay.
All right. So what is trauma? Okay, great. So trauma it results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual. And that can be physical or emotionally harmful or even life-threatening. And trauma has lasting adverse effects on anybody's just overall functioning. And that can be mental, physical, social, emotional, and even your spiritual well-being. Whenever I first came into this position, I just knew of trauma as trauma. but I've come to learn that there are 3 types of trauma. And so we wanted to highlight those for you so that you too could be aware of the types of trauma, especially when it comes to working with the patients that you're working with. So acute trauma, that's going to just be a single event that has occurred. It has a beginning and an end typically. So on this, you can see that would be an example of a car accident. It could also be some sort of natural disaster. Um, Chronic trauma is going to be a repeated trauma. It's long lasting. You're being exposed to it for a longer period of time. It also can lead to long-term psychological effects. And so this might involve, abuse or violence. One of the things we see frequently with our kids is neglect, and then maybe even like physical or verbal abuse. So when you have both of those traumas that have occurred, we have complex trauma. And so that's going to be that combination of the acute and the chronic trauma. And this is something that we see a lot with our kids. And when you have complex trauma, that is what is going to be disrupting that development and just one's overall sense of self. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So we came up with some statistics that we got from earlier continuing eds. Early maltreatment leads to twice the likelihood of developmental delays. An estimated 35% to 73% of the foster youth population experience language difficulties. And then 58 to 84% of individuals in juvenile justice systems have a language disorder. And so these were just kind of staggering statistics to us. A lot of times we think of kids with certain behaviors and, oh, they're so bad. But when you look, oh my gosh, do they have a language disorder? What is going on with them? Are they even understanding? And so this is just kind of staggering, and just to help you think about these kids in a different light. That they do have other struggles other than those behaviors, and these struggles may be causing the behaviors.
And that was something that Paul and I were talking about earlier. Is we see this a lot with our kids that come into our unit here, where they come in and they have been receiving, they're attending school, but they have not been getting any sort of therapies. They have a large paper trail behind them of behaviors, and there's documentation of these behaviors and just how bad these kids are. And then once they get in here and we start testing, the amount of language disorders that are discovered is just shocking, and then but it's wonderful because we're able to like identify something that has been happening and hopefully change the lens in which the people that are working with that child can now view that child through and understand that those behaviors are not stemming from an intentional standpoint, but that there's true underlying causes for those things. So I wanted to include this slide about trauma in the brain and these specific areas of the brain, because trauma has a direct impact on our brain's development. And so these particular parts of the brain, if you think of a brain, I'd like for you to think of it, if you're not familiar what it looks like, as kind of like a pinto bean. I always show my fist. And so these areas of the brain lie deep within the brain, and our skills for language and cognition, executive functioning, those are all going to be growing and moving forward towards the front of the brain. They're higher level skills. So you're building upon them. These areas within the brain are deep within the brain. And so they are going to be that foundation, and trauma impacts these areas of the brain directly. So the amygdala is responsible for like processing all of our emotions, especially for anxiety. And when someone has experienced trauma, it can overactivate the amygdala, and that results in this hypervigilance, hyperarousal, the heightened fear. So you're going to see these really over-exaggerated responses to something that we might perceive as nothing, right? The limbic system it's what is going to promote and regulate those emotions and behaviors, the motivation and memory. This is especially involved with survival. And when someone experiences trauma, it's going to shut off that pathway to those higher regions in the brain that I was talking about. So, limbic system deep in the brain. And if it is affected, the pathway to communicate to the language and the executive functioning and other skills is going to be disrupted. And so it will directly affect one's ability when it comes to those skills. The hippocampus is responsible for learning and for memory. It responds to trauma by having a reduced volume. So it's going to affect its overall just functioning, and it can increase cortisol levels. The corpus callosum is like the bridge between the two hemispheres in the brain. You know, our hemispheres have to be able to communicate, but trauma actually affects the volume as well of the corpus callosum. And so those hemispheres will have a difficult time communicating, which can then in turn affect the our motor skills, which that's something Paula looks at, and with crossing midline in our bodies, and a lot of the kids have struggles with that. And then the last one is the cerebellum, and Paula mentioned this as well when it comes to like motor coordination. That is going to be at the base of the brain, and it is responsible for all of our motor movement and like being able to balance. And the trauma again reduces the volume of the cerebellum, and then one's ability to like be able to make those connections also to the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of what Lacey is talking about, trauma, it doesn't affect just the emotions. It fundamentally alters how the brain processes sensory information. And so when a kid does experience trauma, especially complex trauma, the brain kind of remains in this state of hypervigilance. And so we have to realize that this absolutely changes how sensory information is received and processed and interpreted. Okay.
I think it's Carol in the chat had asked what part of the brain regulates impulse control, and Lockie responded the frontal, and that is correct, the frontal lobe. And so you've got all of these areas that are directly impacted at the base of the brain, deep within our brain, and that frontal lobe is going to be up here. And so if this is being affected, it directly is going to impact the frontal lobe and our ability to handle our impulses, that inhibition piece of things.
Yeah, and we'll expand upon that in just a few minutes. So good question.
Okay, so a few years back, I took a really nice course on trauma and language development, and I pulled this slide from them because it stuck with me so much, and I actually share this with our families here quite often. On the left, you're able to see the typical development, and at the base is going to be that survival. And so if we, come up with hopefully experiencing very little to no trauma, this is going to be like the typical development of our brain. And so we're not living in survival mode. We're able to regulate and then be able to, learn social skills and have higher levels of cognition. However, if you experience developmental trauma, you are going to be living more in that heightened state, in that survival mode. And it's harder for you to maintain regulation and to have those social skills and be able to have those higher level thinking skills.
Yeah, and I'll just say, if you take anything from this presentation, print this slide, because it is a good reminder to kind of guide you in your treatment of that child. Needs first. If they're in survival mode, we're gonna need to make them feel safe, comfortable around us before we can get to any of those other higher level skills.
Also, with the pyramid, I'd like to, remind you to think of it like we've been talking about the brain. All of those higher level skills are dependent upon that survival mode and if we can be regulated. And so whenever a child starts to become dysregulated, all of those skills that they've learned and that they have are going to start to decrease because their brain is saying it's danger time and we, need to focus on this survival mode. And so you'll see a decrease in their language skills, in their sensory processing skills whenever they start to become dysregulated.
And so we have a couple of questions in the chat. Will you get a copy of these slides? I think Laura will send a PDF out of the presentation. Is that correct?
Yes,
Laura, and I'm sure she'll address that more at the end too. Oh, okay, perfect. And then Crystal, so would the goal be to reshape the pyramid to be somewhere in the middle of typical and developmental trauma? Well, our ultimate goal is typical development. That's what we want to go for. And so it's not really about reshaping the pyramid. It's just about meeting their needs. Where are they and how can I meet their needs to make them the most comfortable and the most successful? And the hope is that in time, as they deal with the trauma, process the trauma, and that's kind of, everyone else's specialty that's on here to work with that part, is that, it will resemble more of the typical development pyramid. Okay. Oh, another favorite slide.
So, again, I learned this at one of my trauma courses that I took, and this is our window of tolerance. So we all have our own window of tolerance, and that's just, our ability to sit here, to be able to regulate and be able to put up with, everything that's being thrown at us. But what happens when someone has experienced trauma is that their window of tolerance shrinks. And think of it as like that threshold. We are all able to handle so much, but when you've experienced trauma and you've gone through those things, your fuse is shortened, and it's not your fault. It's how our bodies respond. It's a protective mechanism. And so what happens is when our window of tolerance is shrinking, we're more likely to become dysregulated. And so you can become dysregulated in this hyper aroused state, which is like the fight or flight. You might see someone being overly anxious and angry and just sort of out of control. Or you might see a hypo aroused state where they are zoning out, they are not engaged, they're shutting down, they freeze. And so it's just important to keep this in mind working with our kids, because they're really trying to do the best that they can. But the more trauma that they have been exposed to and experienced, their fuse and their window is going to be so much shorter.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, guys, I'm going backwards.
Okay, so with language and how it's impacted by trauma, I've kind of been throwing it out there as I've been going along, but you're going to see delays in the receptive and expressive language skills. They will have, more than likely, poor comprehension. They'll have a hard time following directions, just being able to keep up in conversation. A lot of times I'll hear people say they're smart. They talk to me. Okay, but great. Have you just been asking yes or no questions? Have you been asking leading questions? How open are those questions you're asking them? It's like an onion and you're peeling back the layers. Also, some of the kids might be able to use their manners and yes ma'am, no ma'am, but when you actually start digging and looking a little bit further, you'll start to see those deficits. They also will have a really hard time when it comes to being able to express their wants and needs and have just good conversation. Is the conversation true back and forth conversation? Or are you the one that's actually leading the whole conversation? How much is this child actually responding to what you're saying? Whenever we ask kids questions, I like to ask a lot of probing questions. If I say, if you could have any magic power, what would that be? And they say, speed. And I'm like, ooh, that's pretty cool. Mine's not speed though. And then I'm waiting and I'm like, do they have that knowledge and that comprehension to pick up on? I'm sort of like reaching for them, like, will you ask me, well, what's mine? What kind of magic power would I like to have? So like, instead of me just sharing it with them, and so just gauging that back and forth, you're going to see those struggles with the kids. They'll also have struggles with their pragmatic language skills. That's going to be their social skills. And we have kids come in all the time, which Paula can share, but we're gonna see those struggles with them being able to just simply make a friend and maintain a friend.
Absolutely. We were talking about this earlier. One of the kids on my little get to know you question sections, I ask them about their friends at school. Tell me about your friends at school. And a lot of times they'll say, I have a lot of friends at school. And I'll say, oh, okay, what are their names? And then they'll say, I don't remember, or I can't remember, or there's too many to remember. So a lot of times they, have a poor perception of what a friend is and how a friend acts, which is why we do a lot of group sessions where we kind of go over those skills. This is what a good friend would do. We provide a lot of examples, a lot of coaching, just to kind of help them along. And we did have a question in the chat. Did you see that, Lacey?
Yeah. So
Okay.
when it comes to word finding difficulties and complete resistance to express, so whenever I typically have a patient that has word finding difficulties, I think the best way that you could differentiate that between them just resisting from saying something or like being open to expressing their emotions, when they're having a word finding difficulty, they're going to be um, saying and they will be possibly describing what it is they're trying to say, and like it's called circumlocution, so they're like talking around it trying to get to it. And so that's probably the best example I can give off the top of my head as far as word finding. I mean, there are numerous times whenever we meet with the kids, especially on the front end of things, where they are very withdrawn and not willing to really share anything. And we don't really press them in those sort of moments. We just kind of move on and find other ways to establish rapport at that point.
Yes, very good.
Gary, you are correct.
Okay. Cognitive and social development.
Yes, so we will also see deficits within the executive function skills after experiencing trauma. So that lack of impulse control, they will be really rigid and inflexible in their thinking, really struggle with theory of mind, knowing, being aware that they are their own person and Paula is her own person and we all feel our own feelings. I had a kid who I presented them with a picture the other day and I said, so this group is on a field trip. How can you, what else do they need to bring from home? And they were like, they are not on a field trip. And I'm like, but they are. And so they had a really hard time accepting that I was putting this situation into this picture. They were just so like, sure, nope, this is what it is. They will have a really hard time with their attention span and like being able to shift that focus. We'll see a lot of struggles with working memory, poor emotional regulation, like a decrease in that frustration tolerance, and then the dysregulation. And again, difficulty, with those sort of peer interactions and reading those social cues.
Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about sensory dysregulation. So obviously, our kids with trauma, trauma histories do show sensory processing challenges, and it's important to remember. Some kids may look to be defiant or look to have ADHD, but they might actually be a child kind of stuck in a dysregulated state. And so you'll see on the slide we have hyper-responsive, hypo sensitive. Sorry, guys, my camera's messing me up. And then we talk about sensory defensiveness. So the over responsive kids, those are the kids that cover their ears when they hear loud noises. Maybe they're distressed by light touch. So I like to say, if you're walking through a dark alley at night and it's new, you don't know where you are, what's happening, you are going to be in this hypervigilant state. And if something just brushes you or taps you lightly, you're going to jump out of your skin. And a lot of times this is how our kids feel. So if you are going to touch a kid with their permission, of course, you want to do it in a firm manner, because this is more calming and regulating than light touch. The under-responsive kids, these are the kids that always look kind of zoned out. Maybe they just don't even look like they're aware of what's going on in the world. They're in their own world. And on the flip side, they can also be those sensory seekers. So they're the kids crashing and bumping into things because they need that input to regulate. And so they'll do things to the extreme. So that's another way that you can tell they're having an under response. And so a lot of times, this isn't just a preference. It's the child's nervous system, and it's trying to protect itself. And so that's why you will see some of these sensory seeking behaviors. So what we want to do, and sensory defensiveness, just to touch on that really quickly, sometimes that's just routine input that they feel every day, and they feel threatened by that. And that's common to see in our kids with complex trauma. So this is the kid who screams when you brush their hair, or who doesn't want to take a bath or a shower or something like that. They have really strong reactions and aversions to things. So they're not being difficult, but their bodies and their brains are reading these sensations as dangerous. And so it's important to, have that background when you're working with them. They're not being defiant. They're not doing it because they don't want to do it. They're doing it because their body is literally telling them you're in danger. And so keep that in mind. And so, there is that link there that we need to be aware of. Okay, so because of all of this, our kids who have been exposed to trauma and everyday activity can be triggering. Okay, and so Lacey just put up here on the screen stress responses in children. This is a good reference if you're trying to figure out kind of where your kid is regulation wise. There's fight, flight, or freeze. And it's kind of helpful because some of the things, like for the flight response, preoccupied, busy with everything but the thing. But the thing they should be doing. And so we see this a lot with our kids. They're really good at getting out of things because they're triggered by them, and they're in this flight stage. And so we have to be aware of that so we can, bring them back down and get them regulated again. And so we look at executive functioning. That's planning, initiating, sequencing tasks. Yeah, you can flip to the next one, Lacey. Okay. That's good.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Because all of these things play into making a regular everyday task feel very overwhelming. And so, we want that child to be regulated because just like Lacey was talking about earlier, when we have a dysregulated child and we're kind of stuck at the base of that triangle in survival mode, we're not going to get to the higher level skills because our bodies just won't let us. Okay. So let's see. You'll see in this slide here, we just talk about some of the different things that you'll see: difficulty tolerating noise or transitions. Transitions are big, especially in school. And so we just kind of strive to create a predictable routine. We use a lot of visual schedules and even breaking down hygiene tasks. So like brushing your teeth or taking a shower, we have visuals that we actually put in the bathrooms because we don't want them to stress over thinking about what the next step is or stressing that they skipped a step. So this kind of takes some of the anxiety out and again, makes it more predictable. And that kind of creates that feeling of safety and comfort that they need.
So Christina asked in the chat, so if the child is still in a traumatic environment, would the goals be different than if the kid has a trauma history, but is currently in a safe environment? How do you assess for that? So this is an area when I would say interdisciplinary care is the best care because the goals that you might be referencing would not necessarily be goals that Paul and I would work on from our roles that we do. And especially here in our particular setting, we don't necessarily do therapy here because we are a straight diagnostic unit, which we are going to share a little bit more about our unit later. But I would probably seek out the help of a psychologist or a psychiatrist to see how they would kind of navigate this situation. I will say there are instances when a child is with us and they don't always go back to the best environment, and that can be really frustrating. But what we can do is make the best recommendations for that family and those individuals working with them to try to help navigate their current state. Um, I hope that that kind of
Yeah,
explains that.
absolutely. It's just kind of, oh, it's just such a hard subject because you want them to be in a safe environment, and sometimes just providing education to the parents. Like, again, it's all about that sensory perspective too. And hey, you know what? They get really scared when they don't know what's going to happen. So maybe if you kind of told them about the routine or had a calendar, a visual of some kind. So sometimes educating the parents or the caregiver can be beneficial as well. Or, hey, if you start to see these signs and symptoms, that means, you know what, they're having a really hard time, back off a little bit, suggest to do an activity that's less demanding or whatever the case may be there.
And also, just meeting the child where they're at. The nice thing about therapy, regardless of the setting and like the discipline that you're in, you have the ability to change your therapeutic goals. And what might be the target that day might not be the target the next time that you guys meet. And I feel like sometimes we just have to, I always tell my students, you just got to go with the flow here. You never know. We always go in with a plan, and not a day goes by when we follow that plan through.
It never irons out.
I think just changing your goals to meet the child where they're at in that particular situation is the best way to go about that.
Perfect. Okay, and this is kind of what we already addressed. So the goal is to just keep everything consistent, take away some of that anxiety and some of that fear. But we've listed here some different ADLs, different things that kids have to do every day, and some reasons why, coming from a trauma background, it might be difficult for them to do that. And so again, back to feeling safe in their environment, exposing them to something that maybe they're really having a hard time with, little bits at a time, making it a pleasant experience, playing games, singing, using a model, like if you had to brush teeth or something, brushing the teeth on your stuffed animal, or I got a little set of teeth on Temu and I'm like, take the kids and let them use the toothbrush and learn how to brush teeth on that sometimes. And so it just really depends on the kid, but it goes back to what Lacey was saying too. We want them to feel safe, and we have to meet them where they are.
Okay, so I think that I'm trying to remember. Someone in the chat had made a comment about like the kids and how they can be perceived as like a bad kid. And that is absolutely true. The way that trauma affects one's language and their communication skills, it can oftentimes present as these behaviors. And so if you're having a difficult time with your language skills and you don't always understand everything that everyone is saying, and you have a hard time being able to just express yourself, you are likely going to see behavior stem from this. I like to give the example of like if you were in another country and you had an emergency and you couldn't speak the language, you're trying to communicate and you are going to become dysregulated. We all get frustrated like that, right? It happened to me in Ireland, and I went to the airport, and my brother did not end up arriving on time, and I had to be there for 8 hours by myself. I tried to rent a car, and the lady's Irish accent was so strong. I literally could not understand her, and I started crying at the car rental desk, and I just had to step away and like reset myself because I was becoming so frustrated. But it goes back to our brain and how we respond in those situations. And our language is a higher level skill. And with me being frustrated in that moment and I feel like I'm pretty typical. I lost my skills to communicate and was becoming dysregulated. And this is what happens to our children. And so, if they can't understand those things and they're not able to communicate, we're going to see those frustrations. We might see defiance, like those class clowns, the bullies. Those kids are likely going to have a hard time with language skills, and they're finding a way to sort of get around having to do tasks that are difficult for them. And so they're going to do that sort of thing. The same with like withdrawal. They might become isolated and avoid things, or refuse because they are already struggling. And so they're like, nope, I'm not going to do it. And then we all too often see the aggression as well. It's like that survival mode, fight or flight. If you're not able to communicate and you're having a hard time with your sensory processing and whatnot, you might physically react or verbally react. And one of the things that a quote that I had come across years and years ago that I have always held strong was, they aren't giving us a hard time, they're having a hard time. And we all too often have to remind ourselves of this, because working with the children that we work with is challenging. It's hard. And it's not always a walk in the park. But we have to remind ourselves that they're having a hard time and we're just trying to do the best that we can to support them where they're at.
Perfect. We put this slide in here, and we know that you all are probably very familiar with this, the trauma-informed approach, about having safety, a trustworthy environment, transparency, peer support, and on down the line. These are things that we do on our unit, and we've done it so much, it's just kind of second nature. So it was kind of cool looking at this. We were like, oh my gosh, we do all these things. But just to be clear on your expectations for the kids, that's very helpful. Like when we do groups or individual sessions, we're very clear. And if we say something, we mean it. So if we say we're going to do 2 things and then you get a break, oh, by golly, we're going to do 2 things and we're going to take a break afterwards. And so we do stick to the plan. And that's just really important. Again, developing that sense of self for that child. They have some control. It's about giving them a sense of control back in their body, in their space. And so that's very important.
So, Paula and I have been working together now for about 5 years.
Mhm.
And prior to Paula coming here, we mostly did speech, OT, and we have merged completely. And so we wanted to share some of just our own strategies that we utilize with the kids, whether it's in a group session or in an individual session. One of the most important things is that rapport. With the kids we work with, they are so guarded, or they have such poor understanding of relationships where immediately they're best friend and they have no clue who we are. But building that rapport is so incredibly important, and being able to have some form of regulation, co-regulation. If we are not regulated and we're having a frustrating time, we are not going to be able to help them to regulate. And so, like I was talking about, I had to reset in Ireland. We tell our kids that all the time. Sometimes we have to reset too. I have a beanbag in my office, and we have to be able to regulate and to be able to support our kids. We have to meet them where they're at. So establish that rapport, have that regulation together. Make sure you're using like really simple and clear language. It might seem overkill sometimes, but it's better to make it too simple than to make it too much for them, because it's just going to make them feel lesser sort of a person, or like maybe even embarrassed to ask if they're not understanding something. If you meet a child in the lobby and you go to take them to your office and you're like, all right, we're going to go to the office. You can put your bag down, have a seat on the couch, and then we'll pick out a toy. You probably don't realize that you just told them 4 different things to do. And that can be super overwhelming. And unfortunately for these kids, if this was like in a home environment or in a classroom and the teacher said that and they forgot that information because that's how their brain operates, they would be looked at as if they didn't listen. Why aren't you listening? Why didn't you do what I told you to do? I told you to go to the office, to put your bag down, to sit down. We'll choose. It's a lot. So break it down. Be short, be simple. Use visual supports if you can. We're all big list people, right? It's human nature. And so making lists is a great way to help our kids to sort of keep them on track. Well, like Paula said, if we're going to do 2 things, we might have said 2 things and they think, "Well, we're going to be in here forever." We're like, no, you're not. Here, let me show you. We're going to do 1, 2, and then let them check it off. And they're being involved in that process. And when they check it off, it makes them feel like, oh, I'm doing good. I'm getting it done. And they also, because it's visual, they can see there is an end in sight.
Absolutely. And I always laugh because whenever we do that with the kids, usually mine involves writing with the kids. And most of the kids we get hate to write. And so we'll make our list out. And when they mark off that writing part of their list, they will just scribble it into oblivion. And I'm like, all right, you got it marked off. But it also, it's like a sense of joy and gratitude that they've finished something. So that is nice. Okay. And so we've kind of been talking about interdisciplinary collaboration, and we feel very fortunate that we have such a dynamic team here, that, we don't get our feelings hurt. I'm not like, oh, I'm OT, I can only do the sensory processing, you can't do anything, Lacey. I feel like we work well together in that, we understand what is best for our clients, for our kids. And I'm going to coach Lacey. Hey, what did you see? Okay, try this next time, try this. And so when she has that child, she will try those interventions. And the same with me. I feel like if I have a kid that has word finding difficulties or, maybe some pretty significant language delays, I want to be like, hey, can you give me some pointers? What can I do to help this kid when we have our sessions? So, just be flexible, treat the whole person, don't get bogged down by, what your specific job is. Okay. Somebody in the chat asked, Crystal, is there a method you use to assess where exactly your client is at before you begin your plan? I would say it's a dynamic plan. I would say it changes on the daily. Again, it goes back to meeting the kid where they're at. If you come in and they're in a dysregulated state, you want to do that co-regulation, right? You want them to be able to trust you, and you want to model for them, how they can regulate, some coping strategies, things of that nature. You have anything to add to that, Lacey?
When our kids are admitted here, we get fairly large packets that give us a glimpse into where the child possibly is at when they come to us. But what we see a lot is that that is all coming from the perspective of adults that are working with them and not from the child themselves. And so it's not until we actually lay eyes on the child and introduce ourselves to them that we really start to get a true feel for them and figure out, okay, where are we going to start with this? What assessment are we going to do? Am I even going to pull an assessment today? Or maybe I'm just going to spend some good time with them and do an activity, teach them a game. Like I said before, we really go with the flow, and we just have to kind of meet them at where they're at that particular day, So one of the kind of the motto of our unit here is children do well if they can. And I like to be really blunt about it and just say what child wants to suck? No child wants to be yeah, I'm a loser. Children do well if they can. And so if they're struggling, they're not going to be able to do well. And so we have to really keep that in mind. So whenever we have something that's if a kid's struggling on the unit, we have 3 options for like how we can handle that situation. So plan A is very adult driven, my way or the highway. This is where, the adult is like, I said to stop, you need to stop. And this one here, we typically only reserve for like if a child is becoming aggressive towards themselves or others. That's when we might be a little more firm and we might have to, have them step away. They might have to be removed from whatever is taking place. Plan C is this really worth fighting over? Like, do we need to pick this battle? It's really like if someone is sitting there tapping their paper on the desk and, we could be plan A and just tell them to stop, and it can end up escalating and turning into something else when we ourselves could have ignored it, or we could have said, hey, are you feeling fidgety right now? Let me give you something.
Give you a fidget.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have been fidgeting.
We practice what we preach
this whole time.
Yeah.
But why are we gonna like make a mountain out of a molehill? It's kind of like you just pick your battle, like pick and choose. And then plan B is really like our biggest thing that we really try to utilize here, and that's where we really talk it out with the child. First of all, the child has to be regulated before we can even do this, because we know if they are in a dysregulated state, their language skills, all that executive functioning is not going to be really accessible at that moment. So once they're cool, they've calmed down a little bit, we're going to talk to the child. We're going to acknowledge their emotions and, let them know that they're valid and how they're feeling. And let's talk about what happened. And we work through it. We take back steps. We figure out what was the trigger. And if we can identify that trigger, then we can figure out, well, what could we do differently next time? And how can we try to like make a plan for the next time this might happen, and just really support the child in this whole discussion. Something that's nice about this is that the child has a voice and they are involved in that plan, and they're more likely to follow through because it didn't come from us. It was their idea and we supported them along the way. So these are a couple of things that we also like to utilize when things just aren't working. When I first got out of school, I was like, yay, speech, let's talk, talk, talk. And I just dominated everything. But I really learned after a while that it was important to just stop talking. And I learned the acronym OWL, to observe, wait, and listen, from the Hannon program, which is a program that you can use for children with autism. And it really has opened my eyes to so many things that we miss as providers, because we're so used to coming in and we're here to like, let's fix it, let's take care of them, we're the adult, let's take the lead. But really, if we just stop and observe the situation, observe the child, we can learn so much about them, following their gaze, looking at their body language that day. Are they tense? Are they dysregulated? Even their voice, are they more like staccato and sort of angry, or are they like more high pitched? Just taking in those observations and waiting and listening, you can learn a lot, and just stopping and taking in those sort of moments.
And I really do believe that is so important with working with kids with trauma. I mean, with kids in general. Like Lacey said, a lot of times we just kind of have this idea in our head. Okay, we're going to get this done. We're going to work through this, and we're going to come up with this. We're going to do these things. We're going to meet these goals. But you really have to just see where the kid is at that day. How are they functioning? What are they having problems with? How can I help them to be the best person they can be? And a lot of times too, as you'll see on the list, environment, sometimes the lights can be very triggering for kids. And I know, Lacey, we just talked about this earlier about a kid who was doing some psychology testing in a smaller room. And, we have these big fluorescent lights, and it was just so bright, and they could just see the lights blinking, and it was very hard for them to focus and concentrate. And so one of the staff members, Mr. Wayne, he was like, what if we remove one of the bulbs? And so you could still see, but it just wasn't as intense. And so then that kid was able to finish up testing, without much difficulty. And so that was better. But, we are queens of the fidgets.
Mhm.
We always provide fidgets for our kids, wiggle cushions that they can sit on and put at their feet, maybe a rocking chair, maybe a standing desk. And these are also recommendations that we carry over to the school environment, because that's going to help with regulation. And then as you go down the list, just giving them options first, then giving them limited choices, and then just stop talking. That's what I have to do right now. I know we have about 5 minutes left. We're going to just quickly roll through these slides, and we've kind of touched on a lot of these things as we've been talking.
Really learn how to react and respond. That is something that has taken a long time to learn how to do, but we really have to learn how to be aware of our own triggers, be aware of our own trauma, and know how we might react in situations. And so be aware of that, take some self-reflection, know how you look, how you start to respond when you become dysregulated. Be aware, is that impacting your client? Is that impacting your session? I had a student not long ago who had a difficult time in some of the sessions and were triggered by their own trauma, and it did negatively impact how they interacted with patients. And so that was a learning curve for them that they had to learn to be aware of. Also, being aware of language. This was a really more recent trauma education that I took, and it talked about violent language, and it was from a speech therapist who had been at a school in Florida when there was an active shooter. And she had never really thought about language and the language that we use. And, just by simply saying, take a stab at it, that could be really triggering for our children. And so kind of learning how to be aware of the things that you say. I distinctly remember administering a language test to a child, and there were 3 pictures on the page: a foot, a hand, and a belt. And he had to tell me which 2 went best together. And when he saw the picture of the belt, it was just like vomit of the trauma. I mean, he proceeded to just report all of this trauma that had occurred to him. So you never really know when something could be triggering to someone. But just having that sort of in the back of your mind. Trauma affects not just our emotions, but our whole body, our whole individual self, our language processing, sensory processing. And please don't forget that behavior is communication.
And we just wanted to quickly tell y'all about our unit and show you some pictures. We're in the PRI building. We have some tables out in our main milieu area, and you can kind of see this is a cafeteria here where the kids go down for lunch. We have a little sensory gym, a classroom. We don't have a classroom teacher anymore, but we still use that room. We still use that space for testing and different group activities. We have a sunroom where the kids can play games, watch TV. This is a typical bedroom, bathroom. There's a playground. So, we're a 28-day program. We do med washes with the kids. We don't, but our medical director does. And we do the testing. You can see here, we do the full diagnostic workup, speech, OT, psych. We have social work. We have rec therapy. It's just a really cool place to be. And we're so happy that we could chat with you all and share that with you all. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you so
Laura.
much. That was excellent. Thank you. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to tell everybody how they receive their CEUs. After this webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email from me with the link to today's participation survey. If you fill out that survey and when prompted, put in the code for today's webinar, and our code will be 6080. I'm going to repeat that and put it in the chat, 6080. Submit the survey and you'll be sent a certificate automatically through the email you registered for this webinar with. Please note that CEUs can only be given to people watching the webinar live and are not given to those rewatching the webinar on YouTube. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email can be found in the registration email sent by Zoom. All right. And yes, there will be a recording of this uploaded onto our website, and then everyone will receive the slides in that follow-up email.
Okay, and we just want to say thank you one more time. And then Lacey in the chat is putting our unit email, or you have our emails here if you have any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This was fantastic.
Awesome.